Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 65 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Jerry and Kurt today for another episode in our heart rate variability series. So if you haven't been listening for a while, you might want to go back a few episodes. I think this is really fascinating stuff. So I think it's worth your time. We're also working off a series of articles as well. So those are all up at traumainformedlens.org. And even if you want to look at the article for this episode before you continue to listen, though you can keep listening if you want. We'll try to catch up a little bit and summarize at least what we've learned from this article as well. So for episode 65, we're going to do heart rate variability and emotional instability. And again, boy, one fascinating concept after the other. And I think my mind went about a billion directions as I read through this. So I'm excited to process that with you all today. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And hey, Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
You know, I'm thinking about how great Colorado weather is, right? One day it's snowing and the next day I can go golfing. So, you know, I'm just really happy to be here in Colorado, as I know you've been traveling and out in Los Angeles, that they get boring, always nice, warm weather. We get this variability, which is a topic for today.
Yes.
That I think makes it really exciting and healthy. So I'm happy to be where I'm at.
Good positive reframe. I miss 70 degrees and sunshine. I want to put the parka away and go back to short sleeves, but good positive reframe. What about you? What are you thinking about?
Well, I hadn't thought of it, but listening to Jerry, I was like, well, there's Jerry's ability to just tie everything together, no matter what it is. He can find something to tie it together. You can talk about variability in the weather, and we're talking about heart rate variability, and there you got a theme.
There you go.
I was at a meeting earlier it was in Fort Collins, actually, and I was meeting with a large organization that oversees services to people with developmental disabilities, and a bunch of different service agencies all kind of get together on a quarterly basis to talk about changes and how we can cooperate and collaborate with one another. And I love meetings like that. I think that it's so enjoyable to do that. This was my first time at this meeting. And as I've been, kind of recently back into the field of intellectual disabilities and bringing a trauma-informed approach to that field in Colorado, I talked briefly about that was something that I was working on with the organization that I'm with now. And the bright, shiny object for me was the increase in head nods around the room, as it just kind of went all the way around the room, and everybody's like, oh yeah, and that was really great for me as a response from that audience. And I took a lot of positive away from that.
Very cool. Very cool. Mine is actually thanks to one of our listeners, and I apologize. In where our listeners usually put their names, it was only put as an M. So I apologize to this listener that I don't have a name to identify you as. But she recommended the Welltory app. So WELLTORY. That measures heart rate variability through your phone in a really cool way. So it flashes, uses the flash for your camera on your fingertip, and then uses the camera to measure heart rate. And yeah, I was playing around with it today, probably a little too much for all the work that I have need to be getting done. But made me want to buy a heart rate monitor, which I at this part of the day have yet to pull the trigger on. But a really cool app that you can use on your phone, and kind of brings a little bit of what we're talking about into the palm of your hand. And yeah, I am overworked and tired is what it told me. And that's pretty, I will go with that. So
it's accurate. It's accurate.
Yeah, it's batting 1,000%. I'm healthy on a lot of things too, which is good. But it's like, yeah, you need some rest. And it's like, yep, I need some rest. So yeah, Tori app. You might want to check it out because, again, it's cool to see your own heart rate variability as we go through this series. So thanks to our listener, whoever you are. Again, I wish I had your name with that, but thank you for that. I'll be playing around with that and probably give some more updates as the weeks goes on. So Kurt, I'm going to turn it over to you. You gave us another great article this week. So let you kind of introduce this and some of your initial impressions.
I'm going to go back to your bright, shiny object real quick because the technology that uses is really, really cool.
It is, yes.
It's got a measurement system called Optical Measurement. And it measures the fluctuations in the blood flow in the capillaries of your fingertip that are associated with each beat of your heart. So you get an increase in blood volume all the way out to your fingertips every time your heart beats. And it picks up that beat-to-beat interval. And that's how it measures heart rate variability and calculates, which is really, really incredible that we can get that all the way out of this extremity and get such great access to a measure that I think our whole series of articles is making the argument that it's a really important and useful measure that we can use to help both ourselves and others. So I think it's really, really cool technology. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Whoever suggested that, I think, thank you to put that out there.
Bam.
Em.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Em.
So we're going to talk about the article today titled Affective Instability in Daily Life is Predicted by Resting Heart Rate Variability. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the design of the experiment just to talk through what this actual procedure was, what some of the measurements were and the timing of them. And then I want to go into talking more about one of the key points from this article that is a takeaway, I believe, is that it connects the functioning of the heart and a measure that we can get from physiology to a neural network. And that neural network is connected then to how we experience and how we regulate emotions. And I think that's a really important tie that will be a theme through other articles that we'll read. And this one establishes that tie. So the article, the subjects, I think, was an interesting aspect of this study in that this was a non-clinical sample. And I think that was really pretty cool that they put that in there. And they talk a lot about how affective instability or emotional instability, these large fluctuations in affects are tied to a lot of clinical populations and a lot of clinical issues. But it's also related to non-clinical issues and basic well-being and our basic moods and our basic personality types. And so I think that was a really important tie here, that what we're talking about is not just important to clinical populations and clinical work, but also to the experience of just being a human being. It's important to our own well-being. So I like that tie in this article is, 100 and something undergraduates contributing to the abuse of undergraduates throughout the country.
Okay. And how do we know they're a healthy group?
At least
it's the only group we know anything about. So
as a part of the study, they were told, please don't drink 2 hours a day. We can go that far in our assumption about
that's good.
Population. So the study was conducted over a period of 8 days. And what they basically did is said, we're going to come in, you come into to a lab, we're going to take your heart rate measurement. And they used a polar heart rate measure, which is pretty cool that now we can pull that from all of the measurement that this specific model of a regular heart rate monitor, they can pull essentially the EKG data from it and calculate all these different measures from it with the right software. So we're getting, as this app I think is showing, we're getting better access to this technology to be able to use it. So they take their heart rate measurement, and then what they did is they used this measurement method of momentary sampling or experience sampling, which is an important, I think, shift away from retrospective measurements of mood, which are inherently inaccurate and have all kinds of problems from a measurement standpoint, and talks about momentary measurement. And I think that was a really cool aspect of the method used in this study. And they gave them a Palm Pilot, which may tell us a little bit about how long ago that was. It's not a smartphone that they gave them. They gave them a Palm Pilot. Maybe they were just doing it on the cheap. I don't know. They got some Palm Pilots donated.
2013, they started giving those away, I think.
Right, yeah. Right. What we spent hundreds of dollars on at one point is now trash.
Yes.
So they had the students then carry around these Palm Pilots, and they're periodically prompted to record in the moment, what is your mood? And some of them bark like a dog, apparently. He's mad. So then during the middle of it, they did another heart rate measurement, have them come back into the lab. And then at the end of the study, they turn everything in and do one more heart rate measurement. So this all happened over a course of 8 days. Right at the beginning of the study also, they asked them about each student, each individual subject in this study was asked about how do they typically deal with emotional experiences, and do they use a method that is commonly called reappraisal, which is a cognitive process that essentially puts new meaning to an experience, or do they engage in what we call suppression, which is maybe continuing to experience the emotional experience, but suppressing the behavioral expression of that. And so those are two basic processes about how we tend to deal with emotional experiences. So that's everything they put together. And kind of what the questions that they wanted to start asking were, what are the different types of emotion that we experience, namely positive emotion or positive affect and negative affect? Are they related to what method of emotional regulation that we use or what strategy we use? And that was one of the questions in this study, which when you look at all of the data was a big fat no. They're not related to either one of those things. So that was an interesting one. I would have kind of predicted that they would have found something there, but they really found no association whatsoever. So then they wanted to look at heart rate variability, and specifically they were using, kind of going back to the article we talked about last time about different measures of heart rate variability give you different measurement or different indications of the functions of the two divisions of the ANS, right? So you can get high frequency measurement and then you can get low frequency measurement, and high frequency tends to be indicative of parasympathetic activity or parasympathetic modulation, and low frequency measurement tends to be related to sympathetic activity. Both of them are balancing one another out. And they used high frequency. So they were really measuring vagal tone, parasympathetically modulated experience of the sympathetic, or the autonomic nervous system. And what they found, a couple of things. One is they first looked at categorizing positive affect or positive emotion versus negative emotion. And it wasn't talked about in this study very much, but the way that they did that, I think, was really important. And what they did is they used a model called the circumplex model of affect, which is a way of categorizing emotions based on pleasantness versus unpleasantness and high energy versus low energy. And each, you can plot both of those on a vertical and a horizontal plane, essentially, and it creates quadrants. And it's a way of really getting some structure around emotional language and how we describe emotional experiences. You can have high energy, pleasant affect, which we may say, I'm happy, I'm excited. Or you can have high energy, unpleasant affect, meaning I'm angry, I'm anxious, I'm frustrated. And you can have low energy, pleasant, calm, serene, satisfied. Or you can have low energy, unpleasant, sad, depressed. Those are some of the emotional words that we use, right? But it's a nice way of systematically starting to categorize those things and putting some structure to something that's seemingly as unstructured as emotional experience. And so they used those, and then basically correlated descriptions among those 4 quadrants and categorized things as either positive affect or negative affect, and looked at whether or not heart rate variability, specifically parasympathetic activity, was associated with either instability in positive affect, meaning a lot of variability in positive affect, or instability in negative affect. And basically they found that on the negative affect side, once they did a statistical procedure to control for the mean level of affect across all the participants, really kind of flattening that the impact of that out, that there was a slight relationship between heart rate variability and negative affect. And that relationship was a negative relationship. So the lower your heart rate variability, the more negative affective instability those people tended to report. And on the other side of that, on the positive affective side, and this is I think a really interesting one, they found pretty clearly that there was a positive relationship between heart rate variability and positive affective instability, meaning that if you had higher heart rate variability, more parasympathetic activation, more vagal tone, you tended to have more stable positive affect. And so that was a really interesting one that I found as you think about kind of mapping onto individual experience, what it is like to experience high levels of heart rate variability. And one of the experiences that this is telling us about is that tends to be correlated with stability in positive affect. And so that's basically what this study found. And one of the things that they talked about, and I wanted to get Jerry to kind of tell us a little bit more about this neural network connection to what we get in our physiology, is they talk about the neural network involved in downregulating the activity of our heart, or cardiac activity. And that neural network is from our prefrontal cortex, our amygdala, and the hypothalamus, really is connected directly through our vagus nerve to some of our physiology. So Jerry, if you don't mind, give us a little kind of detail on that neural network.
So great explanation, Kurt, of the article. So kind of just to back up a little bit about some of this, is that when we think about this parasympathetic impact regulation of the heart, parasympathetic influence really is a really neat process that is related to response inhibition, the capacity to inhibit responses and to make decisions about how to respond. It's related to attention and an ability to focus. It's related to fear and anger modulation, right? And it's related to our ability to, because we can stop and we can think and we can modulate, our ability to make adaptive responses to the environment, right? And so when we think about that cluster and we look at what we know about our neurobiology, many of those structures are mediated by our prefrontal cortex, right? They're executive functions. And so what we're having in there is really that this heart rate variability is allowing us to have top-down regulation of our limbic systems, right? So you get this activation of the amygdala, which is related to the hypothalamus and to the HPA axis, and right? But we get top-down regulation of that allows us to, in some ways, pause, make some decision, modulate those, and then make an adaptive response, right? And so I think that the interesting pieces of this is we know trauma has the opposite effect of that, right? So that the ability to inhibit responses, the ability to regulate attention and concentration, the ability to modulate fear and anger, the kind of that. So it makes, not only does a study kind of look at this negative correlation between negative affect and heart rate variability, but it also suggests that trauma impacts these relationships, right? And so our ability to regulate physiology, our ability to regulate emotions, our ability to regulate attention, our ability to regulate behavior, our ability to regulate our sense of self and our relation to others is all being influenced by these measures that you're kind of looking at, which is this balance between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic control, right? The brake on that, kind of looking at it. So I think that this interrelationship between all these functions really helps us understand why trauma has such a wide range of symptomatology, because these functions are interrelated, right? And I think the study really kind of looks at it in a healthy population. But when you look at, on top of that, accumulated stress or exposure to some high intensity stress that disrupts these systems, you can see why the cluster of symptoms that are related to trauma, and especially to developmental trauma, really interferes with so many of these capacities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that one of the words you said there is so key, is capacity. And I think about that a lot as a being trained as a behavior analyst, right? We're arranging environments so that if an individual is put in that environment and they respond the way that we've designed it, as planfully, that will result in a positive outcome. And sometimes we find that even in spite of our best plans, that doesn't happen. And so understanding the capacity to then respond to environmental input is tied to heart rate variability. Gives us an idea about, maybe it's not that my environmental design was off, like based on what we know, but maybe I overlay this on top of environmental design, and maybe a reinforcement contingency is not effective because there's no capacity there to respond to it.
Right?
And I think that's
a really good point, right?
And
it also tells us that we sometimes intervene at a cognitive level in terms of words and language, and that really what's dysregulated is in the body.
Right.
Right? And some of the kind of research is beginning to help us make sense of why things like movement, music, drama, all these kinds of alternative interventions help regulate this physiology that makes more traditional kinds of interventions more effective.
Right.
Right? To kind of looking at that, as opposed to, I'm gonna get this person to have insight, and somehow that's going to change their bodies. We know that hasn't, but now we have some measures to help us understand why some people it is effective, right? It might be, and for other populations that are struggling with this physiological dysregulation, talking to them really, or just kind of setting up environments is important, but not sufficient to change some of the things we're kind of looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt, it reminds me of a question that you asked in our last episode about a teacher. Like, what do you tell a teacher on how they could change their classroom, right? And one of the things that we know about education in the United States right now is that positive behavior interventions and supports is like in every class, or it's supposed to be mandated to be, right? And so it's a ubiquitous kind of intervention. And one of this capacity questions is one of the kind of explanations for why it might not work for a lot of kids at that time, or how, and can actually give us some information about how to adjust it. And so if you go into the kind of the discussion section of this article, one of the things that they said for future directions is, what if you did an intervention that actually changed somebody's heart rate variability, that moved it up, then seeing if that actually changed their positive affective instability or their negative affective instability, that would be a manipulation that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
I think we could say that if you did that, you're never going to hurt anyone.
Yeah.
So why not just do it, right? Let's just go for it. So as you think about designing a positive behavior intervention and support system in a classroom, you're using a motivational intervention that's very powerful, and it may be misapplied to the wrong level of functioning, right? So if it's applied to things that require the ability to pause, check in with your internal state, and then make a decision about what you do next, and applying that so that that decision gets made in a direction that's, we'll say, adaptive, right? Or better, leads to better academic functioning. Great, that's a great intervention for somebody who has that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
But if they don't, then we need to shift what we're using that motivational intervention to produce. And it may be activities related to changing heart rate variability,
Right.
bringing down.
So what if, taking what you're saying, what if a teacher would be using this Well-Tory app on a child and in some ways reframe the behavior as misbehavior to physiological dysregulation? And how do I now engage with that student to develop strategies to help them, right? It's like, so as we get this technology more useful, it can, and better train educators about this issue of the gap between, I could be the best teacher and I could be providing the same curriculum to all the students, but this student, because of what their internal state, is not able to make use of that. If I could somehow have some way to communicate, which is what we use heart rate monitors to kind of do, right? Is to begin to help the teacher engage in a collaborative relationship with those students and with the families to understand that we could find strategies as opposed to giving you a bad grade. I begin to intervene in a different way, right? So it really is a very different approach to this process of education. And you know, this developmentally, how do we get a high heart rate variability? What are the experiences that we need to provide children along the way to actually increase their vagal tone, right? That's the questions that we'll kind of maybe talk a little bit about, is that we know that some of our therapeutic interventions don't really address these issues.
Well,
Right?
well, and I think, you know, both of you, I think it's interesting because there's some kind of these, you know, alternative folks in the behavioral management that I've been reading that really talk about, you know, for you know, if you take just the typical classroom, which is, I know there's no such thing as a typical classroom, that the kids that will succeed under one behavioral management program will basically succeed under any or no behavioral program. And yet, in many ways, we have these programs that succeed well for those kids, and yet we've got this other group, which I think this conversation really speaks well to, who have a different biology operating, a different heart rate variability going on. And, you know, these interventions, and I've implement these interventions in settings like child welfare and juvenile justice and housing, where probably nobody has great variability per se. These cognitive sort of, oh, if I do this, I will lose this reward or get this consequence. I will lose a point. I will lose my level. And I think it just really shows that, you know, again, we kind of create these systems for the kids that are succeeding in these systems, and yet for the kids that really need help behaviorally, they often really are the ones that are falling behind. And I think this is a really good point. If we see that they're processing environmental stimulus and their internal biology is operating differently, that boy, if we could create interventions for those kids, knowing that, and I think that there's a challenge to that. I don't think that that's, oh, we'll give that to you in a 3-step process at this podcast. But if we can create things and find ways that work for those kids, we can probably assume that the kids with high heart rate variability will also succeed in those programs as well. And it makes me go back and kind of smile as I brought this up several months ago now in a book that some of the ways, even though we think about mindfulness and all these kind of higher level approaches to creating parasympathetic strength, some of them are like gargling and singing loud. So not all of them have to be even touching anything that might re-trigger somebody. The gag reflex was the third one that I don't suggest anybody does on a regular basis for a lot of reasons, but it's like maybe just singing at the top of our lungs is one of the more effective ways to get a class to be regulated. So I think this just opens so many fascinating challenges to our traditional approaches to behavioral management, but also I think to some of these at-risk populations or these dysregulated populations who we expect to act and respond well to our high variability interventions too. So this just opens like a billion doors.
I think those are really good points, Matt. And the part I want to come back to the article was that this was quote unquote a healthy population, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about it from that way, it's not only understanding heart rate variability of students, but how about the heart rate variability of the teachers?
Absolutely.
To be able to tolerate and modulate their response to these disruptions in classes, right? And so when you have these abilities, measures availability, whether it be teachers' heart rates or teachers' heart rate variability, is to be able to say is, I need to be able to regulate my own system to be able to respond in it, right? And how I define that is younger, less mature nervous systems depend on the presence of a more mature, better regulated nervous system to move to maximum complexity and to do it. So that we now have the ability to go in and in some ways begin to provide some feedback to people on their physiological states, right, which is really an important kind of, that in itself is changing, right? So you getting, it validated you to say, I'm tired and I need some rest, right? As opposed to, oh, I'm just feeling depressed today, or no, you're physiologically tired right now, yeah, right? So if I'm in that spot and I'm getting that reading and I'm with my class, instead of kind of blaming them or doing it, I begin to be able to say, as I know I need resources to kind of look at. So I think as we kind of get a better understanding of these measures, it really begins to help us move towards how do we begin to think about interventions using this kind of information.
To that point, Matt, I want to go back to something you said about behavior management, and it's one of the most common things that I hear people talk about when they say, what is behavior management, or what is a behavioral intervention, right? And that is the description of, if you do this, then you lose this.
Yeah.
Right? That's the conceptualization of a behavioral intervention.
Or get this, I think, lose or get, yeah.
Good. So let's go with I find people designing programs with the loss all the time. Mm. And I think that they can be thought of at times as two sides of the same coin, but I would argue that they are not. That they are fundamentally different interventions. The loss of something or the gain of something are fundamentally different experiences. And they actually require different levels of functioning in order to be effective. This is my argument. You could.
Oh, keep going. You got me.
So let's take this article, right? where we think about capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take the way you described a behavioral intervention, which is the most common way to do it, if you do this, then you get this or you lose this. So,
Right.
So one mistake that gets made often is that is programmed in as too much of a delay between when this behavior happens and when the reward happens. Right? Tolerating a delay requires high levels of heart rate variability, requires high levels of parasympathetic activation. And we're saying that if you have low heart rate variability, which is what exposure to trauma does, your ability to tolerate delays is very, very low. So that gives you some information about how to think about designing interventions that could be effective. Now, you got to have very, very low delay. We've known that in the behavioral world since 1938, right? That's one of the key variables that reduces the impact of environmental experience on behavior is delay between each one. Number one. Right, so then you talk about this other side of it, which is if I do this, then I lose this. That in and of itself requires inhibition. Right? That's what that intervention depends on, the ability or the capacity for inhibition to be effective. And what we're seeing from this article is that inhibition is compromised. You have less capacity to inhibit if you have low heart rate variability. So now we think about, that gives us some more information about how we design interventions. We need to have interventions that are not dependent on inhibitory capacity in order to be effective. Does that make sense? Right, so one of the things that you don't need for it to inhibit is responding to positive, repetitive, rewarding experiences. You can respond to those. You actually need less inhibition to respond to those than you do for if you do this, then you lose. Right, so you can actually respond to an intervention with low delays, no loss component, no dependency on inhibition in order for it to be effective, and you can still put in very rewarding experiences, even if there's still a contingency in there. Now that's kind of the third point, is that a quote unquote behavioral intervention often depends on a contingency between a behavior and the rewarding experience that goes after it. And a lot of it often does, but it doesn't have to. Right? There are a whole category of interventions that we call antecedent-based interventions or non-contingent interventions that are super effective, and we should use them more. And they are used not as often as they should. And so as we think about what we do and about contingencies, there is often kind of there gets to be a little bit of a rub, I think, about the use of contingencies. And this is one of my arguments for why.
Can you define a contingency for our listeners?
Right, a contingent relationship is one that is dependent on one another. Right, so if I want to use. That's when one behavior causes an environmental reaction. Right, so I can't, if I want to eat something, I have to go get it, or I have to cook it. Right, there's a relationship there. I don't get food unless I go do something. Right, that they're tied to one another in a contingent basis. There's also the concept of relationship in space and time, that they can be non-causal, and you can still have an environmental event have an impact on behavior. Right? There can just be connection in time and space. And so I argue that we need a really good understanding of behavioral management. And I think this is a real contribution that behavior analysis can make to the field of trauma, in that you cannot avoid relationships between behavior and relationship. It's like trying to say you're not going to breathe air. They're everywhere. There's no way to avoid them. You cannot emit behavior without it having some impact on the environment, intentional or unintentional. It's just existent all the time. So having the knowledge about how those things will impact behavior is really important.
So I want to kind of how I'm kind of understanding this and kind of throw it out and see. In some ways, you have some type of demand on the individual. And in this time, we're talking about a class that is a student. there's a capacity that goes on internally to that stimulation, processing that information, being able to decide on a kind of response, inhibit responses, activate responses, focus my attention and then kind of engage in those behaviors, right? And in our discussion, we're talking about a disruption of the capacities. Most of the interventions have been about managing the behavior. Well, the behavior isn't the problem. The problem was the lack of either access or development of these capacities. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about providing exposure to positive experiences to do it, you're doing it with an intention of building in those capacities, not just managing these behaviors.
Correct.
Right? And I think that's a shift in mental states that this article and what we've been talking about is kind of helping us, is that most programs are designed to manage behavior, but behavior is the end result of somebody being exposed to something and somebody having the capacities to be able to process it in an integrated way and use kind of higher level abilities to be able to decide on how to respond to it. And I think if those abilities are interfered with or have not adequately developed, we can manage behavior all day long. And those children that you say have the ability to respond to any is because they have those capacities. Right? And so I think we're all saying in some ways the same thing from different, but I want it to be real simple, is that if your program is focused on just managing behaviors without an understanding that these abilities both occur developmentally, they occur within the context of relational interactions, and they occur in a state-dependent way. So that just because I have heart rate variability today, if I'm exposed to an overwhelming experience that doesn't allow me to do it or is associated with some past trauma, I can't access those things, right? And so this understanding of behavior, but understanding of these capacities, understanding how we acquire them developmentally and within the context of relationships, and that they're state dependent, has to be integrated into our interventions and our understanding of why some interventions are effective for some people, but not for others, as opposed to blaming the client almost for not being responsive. You're resistant, you're doing it.
Right.
But it may be that this is not addressing what is interfering with you being in some ways able to respond in a way that's, if we want to say adaptive or expected, or however you want to define it, but we need to kind of look at those ability to kind of engage in what we're asking for. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. So I mean, could I sum that up?
Maybe.
Sure.
Because about what I've been thinking, I think we can take this way beyond the classroom as well. If you're thinking about a homeless shelter situation with all adults in it, I think it's just as relative for that. But really, behaviors that get people in trouble potentially are as much about lack of internal capacity or their internal state at the time, and or maybe lacking the skills to really succeed under that structure. Right.
So I would, that's exactly right. But I want to add is, it also interferes with your ability to effectively use the resource that's available to support them. Mm-hmm. So you could be as supportive as you can possibly be, but if this person's dysregulated internally, they can't make use of it. Or if they have a history of relationships not being supported, to kind of look at that. So if we just think that our intervention is to add more people around somebody, right? It's like, let's just add one more person here and that person, right? That's not going to be effective if we don't really understand that this is a physiological dysregulation that, which has happened sometimes when we're in treatment programs and the kids are dysregulated. We think, oh, just add more people, we'll get it. Now we just have more people dysregulated, right? Because to kind of look at that. So I think that these are really important concepts that as people kind of leave and go away, is to kind of begin to think about how much have I been focusing on just behavior, right? How much have I been focusing just on triggers? And how much have I really been focused when we really have to have an understanding of all this stream of the process, not just one component of it.
And on a moment-to-moment decision-making.
Exactly.
Right. It gets pretty complicated.
And I think, especially working with kids on the autism spectrum, especially some kids that were fairly low functioning, I think one of the things is, I had this statement is I'm an occupational therapy tech as a mental health therapist, because, you put somebody in a bouncy chair, you have somebody brush. I had one kid that it sounds like the worst thing to do to a kid in the classroom, but we turned his desk around, he faced the wall, and he put noise canceling headphones on, and his behaviors just went away. I mean, they went away. And it's like the last thing you'd want to walk into a classroom, see a bunch of kids facing the wall with noise canceling headphones on. But for this kid, it was made all the difference. And, I think that, I don't think a lot of us have the resources per se necessarily in all settings, even education to fully do that with too many kids. But I think it just like when you think about what does this kid need to create a internal environment that allows for heart rate variability, that answer can look a lot of different ways and is probably unique to that one individual. And as Jerry said, on that day sometimes, in that moment sometimes. And I think it's fascinating. That I couldn't do necessarily. I could do some mental health things, but I'd much rather go sit in a bouncy chair because, again, talk therapy, especially for that population, had limited impact. And then I got in the bouncy chair and felt really good. I'm sitting on a yoga ball right now. So yeah, I've taken those lessons beyond. So
but it also, when you understand some of this, right? So why was it that when I was working with kids who could not, say, regulate themselves in the classroom, why was it that when I went to the basketball court and shot baskets with them and moved and did something, that they began to spontaneously engage with me, right? Before we might be saying, well, this kid's resistant and you're avoiding dealing, right? Is that we now know is that intervention is providing pattern repetitive, proprioceptive and vestibular stimulation that's directly related to regulating my physiology. And when my physiology is regulated, I now can socially engage, right? To kind of looking at that. And so some of this research is validating some things that people really knew along the way already, but they didn't have some understanding of why it was working the way it was. Some of it's going to be new, but it isn't all of a sudden that we talk about this and you go, okay, I got to create this whole nother program. There's lots of things that teachers or people in shelters or people who are working in community programs are already doing that they can say is no wonder that was working and why I may need to do it with more intention,
right,
as opposed to just kind of randomly kind of looking at some of those things.
I mean, that increase in intentionality is one of the key things that you can pull out of increased knowledge. It may get this kind of, as you said, the validation of, oh, that's why that worked. And that's why it worked then. right, or here's the conditions that I should do it under, again, is really helpful.
Right, right.
So Kurt, something you said, I do want to kind of follow up on this, because one of the things I often hear, you know, and is the concept of attention-seeking behavior, especially when we talk about children, and you're talking about relational interaction, positive relational interaction being, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a part of their reward system. So how does that play into, I don't know if you use the word attention-seeking behavior anymore, but I wonder how, because I know a lot of people are saying, oh, don't pay attention to that kid, he's trying to get your, how's that inform your thinking? Because that was something I heard thrown around a lot.
Right. Well, there can certainly be categories of attention-seeking behavior, right? And that's really a statement about the function of behavior.
Yeah.
Right? That's what that statement is about. And there are a couple of important questions about it. And I think the first one is understanding from a developmental perspective and from a physiological, neurobiological perspective. If we can overlay some of this knowledge on top of what we know now, one of the questions we can start to be able to ask is, why is attention established as such a powerful motivator that it would motivate a lot of problematic behavior, right? A lot of attention-seeking behavior is really high effort, really a lot of problematic behavior that takes a lot of energy and attention and effort to engage in, which gives you some clues about the power or the reinforcing power, essentially, of attention. One of the questions to think about is, why is it so powerful? And as we get an understanding of how attachment can be related to establishing attention as such a powerful reinforcer or a very powerful punisher, and either way, right? And the ideas of, as Jerry was talking earlier about one of the experiences that we need as children, as developing children, to establish greater heart rate variability or greater parasympathetic input onto our sympathetic division of the ANS, is the attuned interactions of a caregiver that actually functions as our underdeveloped parasympathetic nervous system. It actually enhances our ability to do that. And if that doesn't get developed, then sympathetic activation often drives from a motivating perspective, right? In the behavioral language, we call these motivating operations. These are establishing operations. So if you're trained as a behavior analyst listening to me talk about this, think establishing operation, motivating operation, like that's the word to use, that establishes the attuned interaction of a caregiver as a very, very powerful motivator. So thinking about that, when we go down the road of saying we need to not supply that contingent upon this response or it's going to make it worse, actually not supplying it is going to make it more worse than if you just supplied it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because that behavior might become, they're calling out because they need that.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that you just have to kind of, again, like throw the baby out with the bathwater here.
Yeah.
Right? You can start to be intentional about how you arrange those interactions. A great story out there, and I've told it many times, is about one of the things that children often do when they get driven they're in this state where they've got high levels of sympathetic activation, high levels of anxiety often. They tend to seek out a lot of interaction with caregivers. And they tend to not do it in very kind ways, right? In ways that we want to attend to them, right? So we'll find that they ask for things that they can't have a lot. They may do what we call causing crisis, right? All kinds of collections of really effortful responses that are really become something we need to manage. And if we flip our hypothesis about why it is that they do that, the function of that, to include also a regulatory function, then we can start to do things like, it's not about the content of what they're asking for. It's about being next to you. So you don't got to worry about, yeah, you can have that, or no, you can't have that. It's not even a decision you have to make. And what we've taught people to do is say, you know what, I can't give you that right now. Stay next to me. Don't go anywhere. And now you're using still that would be a very behavioral intervention to actually start to downregulate somebody's nervous system. And then it's an empirical question, right? If your hypothesis is right, then you would see a change in that response contingent on you doing your intervention. And if you don't, then maybe you need a different hypothesis, but at least you went and found out. And that's a good process to go through.
Yeah.
You know, when you think about it, Matt, the same behavior, right? If you saw attention-seeking behavior from a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, you would be going, that makes total sense, right? To kind of look at that. And your intervention would be different than if you saw the same behavior from a adolescent, right? Or an adult. To kind of look at that. But what we know is when you lack certain experiences along the way, on an emotional level, just because you've aged in chronological age, you have not necessarily developed certain capacities if you've missed out on experiences. Right. And especially if the way you have traditionally tried to meet those needs is what did you call them? Crisis, kind of, what did you call them? But operations, but if they elicit negative responses from the people you're trying to get attention from, right? So now you have not only what you didn't have as a child, but your style of managing actually recreates the lack of getting those needs met along the way. So now you have an adolescent who has years of not getting their needs met, and their internal dialogue is about them is nobody cares. Or I can't do this, I would not, right? And so they keep engaging in those behaviors. So I think what occurs is when you reframe something, it really is to reframe it for the individuals responding for that person so that they have an opportunity then to, in some ways, begin to have some experience of being engaged in a relationship that allows them to kind of benefit from the experience at a developmentally appropriate level, not just trying to expect them chronologically to kind of do it.
Right.
Right? So I think we talked about in the last episode about how we assume intention, that because you're an adolescent, your attachments, your attention-seeking behavior is something you can manage and control and know how to kind of do it, right? But it really is, this science is really telling us a little bit about that this is the way I'm trying to, in some ways, regulate my internal state. Right?
Which I think in my final question, absolutely. I'm kind of coming to this conclusion, but I'm not sure if I should, is, you know, if we have low heart rate variability, how much cognitive control are we exerting? In other words, how much, shall I say it, free will or volition are we bringing to our situation? Are we bringing any? Or are we at the, you know, kind of expense of our lack of variability there?
Right. Your ability is compromised under those.
Yeah.
Right. It is less than it would be with more vaguely mediated inhibitory control.
And today we talked about vagal tone is a physiological that's not only internally, but it starts out to be interpersonal, right? Yeah. And so really that's why the power of relationships and having somebody in your life that can both support what you have, but also provide some scaffolding when you're under, really is a very important component of building in. You know, there's research, good research now that yoga creates increased heart, way more so than medication. Medication regulates your nervous system, but it doesn't build heart rate variability. Yeah. Right? So you can actually look better, but not be better. Mm-hmm. Right? Which is what oftentimes you put people in program where there's lots of rules around and lots of structure and lots to do, but nothing's changed internally.
Wow. Well, I have a
I mean,
million.
we could keep going for a
Yeah.
while, I'm sure, but
Yeah, I want to
we
stop
can save it for
science
the next
for
episode.
10 years because we need to catch up. We need to stop. No more research. We just have to look at this one
Just
article.
figure this one out.
10 years across fields to figure this out.
Well, let me
This
end
has been
with this, Matt. Let me end with this kind of
Yes.
thing, right? And this is my hope for our use of physiological measures within a clinical population, right? And we could extend it to non-clinical if we want to, right? But part of what we talked about is that there is a need for both kind of experiences that we've touched on. One, which is regulatory experiences that are essentially in the behavioral world, we would call them non-contingent interventions. You need them frequently, you need them repetitively, and you need them regardless of what you're doing at any given point in time. And there's also a component that needs to happen that is contingent, right? We learn to self-regulate by at times not getting what we wanted and being able to tolerate that, or or having the experience of earning something that required effort. Those are important experiences. And one of my hopes is that we get better at knowing when to do each one of them. And I think heart rate variability might be a step in that direction. That there are times when we have high heart rate variability, when we have the capacity to respond relationally and engage socially and use our cortex to inhibit responses and have different experiences and learn different things. And there are other times when our state has changed and we have low heart rate variability and we have less capacity to inhibit responses, less capacity to socially engage. And in those situations, we need different experiences in order to regulate our internal states. My hope is that we get better at being intentional about when we do those experiences and when they're actually likely to work.
Great ending, man. Great summary.
Yeah. What an episode. Yeah, so the article, which is obviously a must read, will be at traumainformedlens.org with some show notes and discussion questions as well. Great episode, fellas. Like I said, I have to process this one for a while. So I believe if I'm looking at my schedule, this will be our last one published before Christmas. So I want to wish everybody happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Christmas, everything else you might be celebrating. So I always like, as we hit the holidays, just to give a special thanks to all those who, I know not everybody gets the holidays off. A lot of you are keeping facilities, hospitals, and all those other structures open for folks that need them. And I want to spend a special thank you for everybody, and just a reminder to take care of yourselves during the holidays as well. So Jerry, Kurt, happy holidays to both of you, and we'll see everybody next week.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.